She had everything: the corner office, the skyline views, the man who said he'd love her forever. Then one Tuesday morning, a single second on a rain-slicked road took her legs, her fiancé, and every version of herself she had ever known. What nobody tells you about losing everything is that the hardest part isn't the fall. It's waking up the next morning and realizing the world kept moving without asking your permission. This is the story of a woman who had to lose it all before she could finally understand what any of it was worth, and the quiet, stubborn man who refused to let her disappear. If this story already has you feeling something, hit that like button right now and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now let's get into it. The morning everything changed started the same way every other morning had for the past 4 years. With Celeste Holloway's alarm going off at 5:15, a cold glass of water downed in 3 swallows, and a mental checklist already running before her feet hit the floor. She had a 7:30 site meeting in the Garfield district, a 10 o'clock call with the Meridian partners about the North Bank acquisition, and somewhere between those two things, she needed to review the revised rendering package her design lead had sent over at 11 the previous night. She'd been at this pace since she was 26, building Holloway real estate from a 2-person startup operating out of a rented conference room into a company that now moved through deals the way a river moves through stone. Steadily. Inevitably. Without apology. That morning, she showered fast, poured coffee into a travel mug she would forget on the kitchen counter, and stepped into the elevator of her building wearing a charcoal blazer and heels that cost more than some people's monthly rent. Her assistant, Priya, texted her at 5:50 with a revised agenda. Celeste answered while waiting for the car. She did not notice the rain. She noticed it in the car briefly, the way it smeared against the windows of the company sedan and turned the early morning city into a watercolor version of itself. But then her phone buzzed again, and the rain stopped mattering. She never saw the truck that ran the light. She heard it, a sound like the world snapping in half. Then impact. Then nothing, for a very long time. Whopped. When Celeste woke in the hospital, the first thing she registered was the ceiling. Flat white, institution yellow in the overhead light, a single thin crack running toward the corner like a fault line. The second thing she registered was that she could not feel her legs. She did not panic at first. She thought it was the medication. She thought it was temporary. She thought a lot of things in those first confused hours that turned out not to be true. Her fiancé, Derek, was there when the doctor came in to explain what had happened. The impact, the spinal trauma, the swelling, the uncertain road ahead. Derek held her hand. He said the right things. His face made the right expressions. Celeste filed all of this away with the detached efficiency of a woman who had spent a decade managing crisis, and she asked the doctor to repeat the clinical details twice so she could be sure she understood them correctly. Incomplete spinal cord injury, the doctor said. T6 level. There is some preserved function below the injury site, which is genuinely encouraging. With aggressive rehabilitation, some patients in your situation do recover meaningful mobility, but I won't make promises I can't keep. What I can tell you is that you will almost certainly need a wheelchair for the foreseeable future, and possibly permanently. Celeste nodded. She asked 3 follow-up questions. She thanked the doctor for being direct. Then the doctor left, and the room was quiet except for the sound of the monitor, and Derek's hand was still on hers, and she stared at the ceiling crack again and thought about her 7:30 site meeting and whether anyone had called to reschedule it. Celeste, Derek said, did Priya know to move the Meridian call? Celeste. Because if Carver Meridian waits a week, they'll take the offer off the table. They've done it before, Celeste. His voice had something in it she didn't recognize right away. Not grief, not fear, something quieter and more permanent than either. We don't need to think about that right now. She turned her head and looked at him. Really looked. Derek Haynes was 33 years old, good-looking in a practiced, deliberate way, the kind of man who understood the value of appearances because he'd spent his whole career trading in them. He was a commercial attorney. He was steady and competent, and he had loved her, she thought, in the measured, reasonable way that fit his personality, carefully, without excess. Looking at him in that hospital room, Celeste realized she could already read his face like a document she'd been handed at a very inconvenient moment. She was 30 years old. She was a wheelchair user now, or at least she was going to be, and the woman he had agreed to marry. The one who walked into rooms first and moved through the world like she owned it, was gone, or at least changed, and the math on his face told her everything she needed to know about how he'd already done that calculation. She looked back at the ceiling. "You should go home," she said. "You've been here all night." "I'm not going anywhere." "You should." He stayed another 4 hours. He came back the next day and the day after. He was very reliable about it, very consistent, right up until the morning 6 weeks later when he sat down across from her in the rehabilitation center's family meeting room and said, very gently, that he thought they needed to talk about the engagement. Celeste had not cried then. She didn't cry now, 3 months later, in the back seat of the medical transport van that was taking her to her first appointment at the Ashwood Rehabilitation Institute for what would become her regular outpatient program. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and watched the city pass outside the window and thought, very deliberately, about absolutely nothing. The intake coordinator at Ashwood was a pleasant woman named Donna, who gave Celeste a folder of printed materials and explained the program structure with the careful, slightly over-enunciated warmth of someone who had delivered this speech many times and had learned to make it feel personal anyway. "You'll have physical therapy Monday, Wednesday, Friday mornings," Donna said. "Occupational therapy Tuesday and Thursday. And we're also going to be assigning you a mobility assistant for the duration of your program, someone to help with transportation, daily living tasks during your session days, and general support as you build your independence routines." "I don't need a babysitter," Celeste said. Donna's pleasant expression didn't flicker. "Of course not. Think of it less as supervision and more as having someone in your corner while you're learning new systems. Most of our clients find the relationship genuinely useful." Celeste did not say what she was thinking, which was that most of Donna's clients had not spent the last decade building a company on the operating principle that needing help was the first step toward becoming someone's liability. She took the folder. She thanked Donna for her time. She wheeled herself toward the door of the office and negotiated the threshold, the slight bump between the carpet and the hallway tile, with the focused effort that still embarrassed her even when no one was watching. The mobility assistant was supposed to meet her in the main lobby at 9. At 9:02, she was sitting by the window in the lobby watching a woman trying to manage a double stroller through the front entrance, thinking about nothing in particular, when someone stopped in front of her. Celeste Holloway? He was taller than she'd expected. Not that she'd expected anything specific, but something about the voice made her look up. He was around 30, maybe a little past it, with dark hair that could have used a cut 2 weeks ago, and clothes that were clean and pressed, but belonged to a different tax bracket than hers. He had a worn canvas work bag over one shoulder and a carry cup of coffee in his hand, and he was looking at her with a directness that was neither aggressive nor pitying, just level. "I'm Mason Thatcher. I'm your mobility assistant." "You're 2 minutes late," she said. He glanced at his phone. "Yeah, sorry about that. Parking here is a disaster." She had expected him to explain further. The commute, the traffic, whatever. The way people always scrambled when she applied pressure. He didn't. He just took a sip of his coffee and looked around the lobby like a man who had arrived somewhere and was now orienting himself to it. "So," he said, "how do you want to do this?" "What?" "Today. How do you want to run it? I have your schedule here." He pulled a folded printed sheet from his bag pocket. "But I figure you know better than I do which parts you want help with and which parts you'd rather handle yourself." Celeste stared at him. In the 3 months since the accident, she had been spoken to in a particular way by almost everyone, doctors, nurses, her own board members, her mother, her friends from before. A kind of considered gentleness that was really just pity wearing business casual. Mason Thatcher was looking at her the way she'd look at a new client. Attentive, direct, waiting to be useful. It was so disorienting she almost didn't know what to say. "PT starts at 9:30, she finally said. "I can get there myself. I'll let you know if I need something." "Okay," he said, and sat down in one of the lobby chairs, opened his bag, and pulled out a battered paperback. She turned her chair toward the hallway. She stopped. She turned back. "What are you reading?" He held up the cover. It was a history of bridge construction in early 20th century America. The spine was cracked from use. She turned back toward the hallway. She didn't say anything else, but the faint, forgotten shape of something she couldn't name moved through her chest for just a moment before she let it go. Physical therapy was brutal. It had been brutal every day for 3 months, and Celeste had not yet reached the point where she could pretend it was anything other than what it was. Her body, which had once done exactly what she asked of it, now operating under entirely new terms that nobody had consulted her about. Her PT, a solid woman named Greta, who Celeste had decided early on was either a saint or genuinely indifferent to human suffering, ran her through the morning routine with the same relentlessness she brought every session. Weight shifts. Transfer practice. Upper body strength work. 30 minutes of what Greta called functional movement training, which was her polite term for the specific exercises designed to coax her body back toward capacities it had once taken for granted. Celeste did not complain. She had made that decision in the first week and stuck to it. Not because she was at peace with any of this, but because complaining would have required her to admit she was struggling, and admitting she was struggling would have required her to be someone other than who she had spent 30 years becoming. Sweat soaked through the back of her shirt. Her left arm shook on the last rep of the overhead press. She locked her jaw and finished it. "Good," Greta said, without excessive warmth. It was the highest form of praise in Greta's vocabulary, and Celeste had learned to take it. After PT, there was a 45-minute break before occupational therapy. Celeste wheeled herself toward the small cafe near the entrance of the rehab center, a sunlit room with 4 tables and a counter that served mediocre coffee and pastries, and found Mason Thatcher at one of the tables with his bridge book, a second cup of coffee, and an untouched blueberry muffin that he'd apparently bought and then forgotten about. He looked up when she came in. "How'd it go?" "Fine," she said. "Yeah? What does that mean?" "It means you're holding your left arm like it said something offensive to you." She looked down. She was in fact resting her left arm in her lap at a slightly protective angle she hadn't noticed herself adopting. She adjusted. "I'm fine," she said again. "There's good coffee at a place 2 blocks from here," he said. "Better than this. If you ever want to take a walk during a break." "A walk," she said flatly. He looked at her, registering what she'd heard in that word. "A roll," he said. "I'm bad at language sometimes. My daughter tells me that constantly." "You have a daughter?" "Emma, she's 7. He said it the way people say a thing they're proud of but don't perform pride about. Matter of fact. Foundational. Celeste looked at the muffin he hadn't touched. "Are you going to eat that?" "Probably not. I don't actually like blueberry. I don't know why I keep buying them." "Why do you?" He thought about it. "I think I see them, and I always believe I'll like them more than I actually do." Celeste wheeled herself to the counter, ordered the coffee that was probably worse than the place 2 blocks over, and came back to a table across from his. She didn't examine the decision closely. She just sat, drank the coffee, and stared out the window at the street where the morning was turning over into midday, and for the first time in 3 months, the silence around her felt less like absence and more like something she might eventually be able to breathe in. The weeks that followed were not linear. Nothing about recovery is. There were good days, days when the PT session went well, and her body responded and she could feel, somewhere beneath the noise, a version of herself that was stubbornly insisting on existing. And there were bad days. Days when the simplest transfer from wheelchair to the therapy mat required 3 attempts and left her staring at the ceiling of the PT room with a rage so clean and absolute it nearly frightened her. Days when she got home to the apartment, the one she'd bought at 27 when Holloway Real Estate closed its first major commercial deal, the one with the floor-to-ceiling windows that had made her feel, back then, like she'd finally outrun everything she'd started with, and sat by those windows in the dark because turning on the lights felt like more effort than she could justify. She didn't tell anyone about the bad days. That wasn't new. Mason Thatcher showed up at 9 every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday like the world's most reliable fact. He was always on time after that first day, and he never mentioned the 2 minutes again. He brought coffee, the good kind, from the place 2 blocks away, and he didn't talk unless he had something to say, which Celeste found increasingly valuable in a world that seemed full of people filling silence with noise they thought she needed. He drove a 10-year-old pickup truck that had clearly logged a serious number of miles. The back seat had a booster seat on one side and a collection of picture books and small plastic animals on the other. The first time Celeste transferred into the passenger seat and got settled, she looked at the menagerie of plastic animals and then looked at him. "Emma's," he said. "I guessed. What are they all?" "I genuinely don't know the names of all of them. That one, He pointed to a small, bright orange thing near her knee. I've been told is very important and I should not throw it away. What is it? Emma describes it as the main one. I've learned not to push further. Celeste looked at the small orange animal. She picked it up carefully and set it back. Something in her chest did what it had been quietly doing more frequently these past weeks. That small, disorienting thing, like a joint that had been locked finally considering movement. Where are we going today? She asked. Wherever you want. You've got 2 hours before your afternoon session. I was thinking the river road if you're up for it. There's a good pull-off with a flat path along the water. Easy terrain, nice view. But if you'd rather just go back to the center and sit in the cafe, that's also fine. She had been spending her breaks at the center. It was efficient. It was predictable. It asked nothing of her. River Road, she said. He nodded and put the truck in drive. The river road turned out to be exactly what he'd said. A long stretch of riverside path that ran parallel to the water, flat and wide and shaded by old trees that were just beginning to pull back toward autumn. The water moved unhurriedly through the midday light, brown gold in the shallows, darker farther out where the current pulled. Mason set the truck's parking brake and came around to help with the door. Not taking over, just present, hands ready only if she needed them, stepping back the moment she didn't. She'd noticed this about him. He had figured out, apparently on his own, the exact calibration between available and intrusive that almost everyone else in her life had gotten wrong in one direction or the other. She wheeled along the path. He walked beside her, slightly behind, unhurried. You worked construction before this? She asked. She'd read his brief profile when Donna gave it to her weeks ago, more as due diligence than genuine curiosity. She found herself being genuinely curious now, and wasn't entirely sure what to do with that. Yeah, site work mostly. Residential and some light commercial. Did that for about 6 years. And now this. And now this. And a delivery route Tuesday/Thursday evenings, and weekend work with a landscaping crew when I can get it. She looked at him sideways. He said it without self-pity, which was what made it land harder than it might have otherwise. That's a lot of jobs. Emma's tuition for private kindergarten wasn't exactly free, and the medical bills he stopped for about half a second, from a while back. Those take some time to work through. She didn't push it. She'd learned to read when people had put up a boundary without announcing it. They reached a bench set back from the path where it curved closest to the water, and Celeste stopped. The river moved. A bird she couldn't name landed on a rock and then immediately left, apparently disappointed. What happened? She said. Not to him, not really. And yet, with what? She looked at the water. How do you do this every day? He was quiet for a moment, then, do what? Show up, be calm. Do all of those jobs and show up and be... She moved her hand slightly, indicating him, all of him, whatever this quality was that had been making her crazy for weeks, because she couldn't name it. Not wrecked by it. He thought about that for longer than she expected. I don't know if I'm not wrecked by it, he said. I think I've just gotten better at carrying it. Doesn't really feel like the same thing. She looked at the water. She thought about Derek's face in the hospital room. She thought about the board meeting 6 weeks after the accident where her VP of operations, a man she'd hired and mentored and trusted, had proposed with great gentleness that the company might benefit from transitional leadership while Celeste focused on recovery. She thought about her mother's voice on the phone, every call, asking the same question in slightly different words. When are you going to be better? I don't know how to carry it differently than I have been, she said. Which is how? By pretending there's nothing to carry. He nodded slowly. He didn't say that's not healthy, or you should open up to someone, or any of the other things people said that were really just instructions to perform a version of feelings that would be more comfortable for them to watch. Yeah, he said. I did that for a while too. What changed? He was quiet for another long moment. Then he said, Emma asked me why I never looked happy anymore. She was 5. And you know 5-year-olds, they don't ask it as a challenge. They just ask it because they want to know. They want to understand things. She said it the way she'd ask why the sky was blue. He paused. I didn't have an answer for her, and I figured if I didn't have an answer she could understand, I should probably figure out what I actually believed. Celeste looked at the river. What did you figure out? That I was sad, he said. That was basically it. I was really sad and I was trying to manage it instead of feel it. And managing it was exhausting, and the exhaustion was making everything worse. She didn't say anything. I'm not saying it solved anything, he added. I'm still tired most of the time, but it's a different kind of tired. A couple passed on the path, a man and a woman, both running, earbuds in, coordinated in the way of people who have been doing something together long enough to move like one organism. Celeste watched them go. I used to run, she said. It came out quieter than she intended. Mason looked at her, then back at the water. What was your route? Along the river, mostly, from my building down to the old iron bridge and back. About 4 miles. That's a good stretch. The part near the old boathouse? You know it? Worked a job near there a few years back. Good view from the bridge. She nodded. She looked at the water. Somewhere behind the tight, engineered wall she'd built inside herself, something was pressing. Not hard, not yet, but with a steady, patient weight that was new. Or not new. Just very long, unfelt. I miss it, she said. The running? All of it. She looked at her hands in her lap. The version of myself that ran, the version that walked into a meeting and the energy in the room shifted. The version that... She stopped, pressed her lips together. The version that could see the future and genuinely believe she was building it. He didn't rush in with reassurance. That was the thing about Mason. He waited through the silence the way you wait through weather, like he understood it needed to run its course. You're still building something, he said eventually. I'm sitting in a parking lot eating mediocre pastries and trying not to fall on the transfer mat. Yeah, he said. And before this it was something else, and before that it was something else. You think the first version of you that walked into a room and changed the energy showed up that way from birth? She looked at him. People build themselves over and over, he said. You just have to build this version, that's all. She turned back to the water. She didn't say anything for a long time. Neither did he. And somewhere in that quiet, with the river moving and the trees throwing long shadows across the path, and autumn starting its slow lean toward winter, the wall inside her that had been holding everything at bay shifted. Almost nothing, barely a millimeter. And she felt it, and didn't try to push it back. She started asking about his construction work the way she'd once started asking about development projects, the way she absorbed things in layers, building up a picture from detail. He was good at explaining it, not the way a professional explains to a layperson, dumbing it down and rounding the edges, but the way someone who genuinely loved the mechanics of a thing explains it to someone they can tell is actually listening. He talked about load distribution and site drainage, and why residential construction shortcuts always showed up years later in foundation problems. He talked about the specific pleasure of framing a room and being able to see what the space would become. He had worked for a large regional contractor for most of his career, but the company had gone through ownership changes 18 months ago, and the new management had slashed the crew. He'd been picked up by a temporary work agency after that, which was where he'd been since. You want your own company, Celeste said one afternoon. They were parked by the river again. This had become a thing now, a regular thing, without either of them naming it as such. Someday, he said. Yeah. What does that look like for you? Small, at first. Me and maybe 2 guys I know who are good. Residential renovation, some light commercial, build the reputation, grow from there. He looked at the water. It's just the capital. Starting a licensed contractor business costs more than most people think when you're starting from scratch. And I'm not exactly in a position to take on debt right now with Emma and the... He stopped again, the same half-second pause she'd noticed before. With everything. She filed it. She didn't say anything yet, but she started thinking. Emma came with Mason twice in those early weeks, once when his after-school arrangement fell through, and once on a Saturday when Celeste was doing an extended weekend session. She was 7, skinny, with her father's directness, and apparently none of his restraint about using it. The first time, Emma walked into the rehabilitation center lobby, looked around with frank assessment, walked directly up to Celeste's wheelchair, and said, "Is this yours?" "Yes," Celeste said. "Can I sit in it?" "Emma," Mason said. "No," said Celeste, "but you can push it for a minute if you want." Emma's face did something delighted and immediate. She moved around behind the chair. "Okay," she said seriously. "I'm going to need you to tell me if I'm doing it wrong." Celeste, who had not smiled, really smiled from somewhere real, in 3 months, felt something lift in her face before she could think about whether she wanted it to. "You're doing fine," she said. "Dad says I should always ask first before touching someone's chair, because it's kind of like touching someone's body, and you need to ask about bodies." "Your dad is right." "I forgot, though." "I know. We'll count this one as practice." Emma pushed her about 12 feet down the hallway, narrating the experience under her breath in a way that suggested she was describing it to an imaginary audience. And Celeste sat inside this smallest of moments and felt, for a reason she could not have fully explained, something that was not happiness exactly, but was shaped very much like its first prerequisite. She called her VP of Operations on a Tuesday night, the one who had raised the transitional leadership proposal, whose name was Glenn, and who had been carefully not pushing since. She sat by the window in the dark with her phone and said, before he could say anything, "I want to see the Meridian files. All of them. Send them tonight." Silence. Then, "Celeste, I'm not coming back to the office yet," she said. "I know that. I'm not ready for that. But I want to see the files. I want to understand where the North Bank project is. And I want to set up a standing call, Wednesdays, where you walk me through current status on the 3 active acquisitions." A longer silence. "Of course," Glenn said, and she could hear something working through his voice, relief, maybe, or recalibration, the sound of someone updating a model he'd built of her that had stopped being accurate. "I'll send everything tonight." She ended the call and sat in the dark, and for the first time in 3 months, felt something that was unmistakably the shape of her own appetite. She told Mason about the call 2 days later. Not as a report. She wasn't performing recovery for him the way she sometimes caught herself performing it for her mother. She told him because the conversation they'd had by the river about building versions of yourself was still sitting with her, and this felt like evidence of something she wanted someone to know about. He listened. When she finished, he said, "How'd it feel?" "Like putting on a coat I'd left somewhere," she said. "Except the coat fits differently now." He nodded. He understood that, she could tell. Not from experience with corporate work, but from the thing underneath it, which was the experience of being a person who had put down something heavy and then gone to pick it back up and found the relationship had changed. "That's not a bad thing," he said. "I know," she said, and she almost did. Outside the truck window, the river moved through the afternoon, carrying whatever it was carrying, going where rivers go. Celeste watched it and felt the strange, uncomfortable, necessary sensation of a future she hadn't imagined yet beginning to take shape in the dark. She didn't have a name for it yet. She let that be okay. There were days, still, when the weight of it was so heavy she could barely get out of bed. Days when the apartment felt like something that had been built for a different person, and she was just living in the wrong architecture. Days when she looked at her hands and thought about everything they used to do without asking, and felt a grief so physical it was almost indistinguishable from pain. But there was also the river, and the coffee from 2 blocks over, and Emma's running narration of everything, and Mason reading his bridge book in the lobby while he waited, and the Meridian files open on her laptop at 2 in the morning while the city did what cities do, and Glenn's voice going from careful to genuinely engaged as she started asking better questions. And there were moments, scattered through the weeks like something small thrown into water, where she caught herself in the middle of an ordinary thing, asking Mason about the foundation problems from a job he'd described, or watching Emma try to stack the small plastic animals in height order, or looking at the revised North Bank rendering on her screen at midnight. And she felt unmistakably present, not healed, not fixed, not the version of herself that ran 4 miles along the river and walked into rooms like she owned the atmosphere. Just present. Which was more than she'd been 3 months ago, more than she'd expected to be, more than she'd thought she deserved. She was very slowly beginning to understand, enough to start with. The Wednesday call with Glenn became the fixed point her week rotated around, though she wouldn't have admitted that to anyone. She set it for 7 in the evening, early enough that she wasn't exhausted from the day's sessions, late enough that Glenn had worked through whatever fires the afternoon had thrown at the office. The first 2 calls were stiff, careful, full of the particular tension of 2 people who had last spoken under circumstances neither of them wanted to revisit. Glenn was thorough and professional and kept his sentences slightly shorter than usual, the way you do when you're not sure how hard to push. Celeste asked questions and took notes in the margins of the printed files and said very little that wasn't directly about the work. By the third call, something had loosened. Glenn made an offhand remark about the North Bank site engineer being the most aggressively optimistic person he'd ever met. And Celeste said, without planning to, "You're describing every site engineer who has ever lived." And Glenn laughed. A real laugh, sudden and unguarded. And then they were talking. Actually talking, the way they used to before the accident turned everyone around her careful and deliberate. She hung up that night and sat for a moment in the quiet apartment with her hand still on the phone and thought, there it is. Not everything, not close, but a thread of the old self still attached to something. She pulled on it carefully. Hashem. Autumn settled over the city in the way it always did. Not dramatically, but by accumulation, the trees turning 1 degree at a time, the light thinning, mornings arriving with a new edge that made the river steam on cold days. Celeste noticed it in pieces, from the truck window on the way to the rehab center, from the riverside path on the afternoons when Mason drove her out there, from her own apartment windows in the evenings when the sun dropped early and turned the skyline orange before disappearing entirely. She had not spent this much time watching seasons change since she was a child. The adult version of her life had been conducted almost entirely indoors, in climate-controlled environments, moving between meetings and airports and dinner tables with such velocity that the outside world had become something that happened to other people. The accident had slowed everything to a pace she had initially found unbearable and was now, reluctantly, beginning to see differently. Not romanticize. She was not going to romanticize it. The slowness still cost her things: patience, independence, the specific fury of needing help with a task that had once been unconscious. But inside the slowness, there was texture she'd been moving too fast to feel. Mason brought coffee, same as always. The good kind. He'd started bringing a second muffin, not blueberry. He'd learned that lesson about himself. And setting it on the dashboard between them without comment, available if she wanted it. She usually did. She never made anything of it. North Bank filed its environmental review, she said one morning, looking out the window as he pulled onto the river road. We've been waiting 3 months for that. Glenn thinks we can accelerate the acquisition timeline now. That's good. It should have happened in August. The delay cost us 2 other interested buyers and a lot of position we'll have to rebuild. But you still have it. We still have it. She looked at the trees. I keep thinking about the design. The original concept was mine, from before. A mixed-use development with real public-facing ground floors, not the fake public spaces developers build to meet zoning requirements and then make unusable. I want to go back to it. I want to actually finish it. Mason glanced at her. What's stopping you? I haven't opened a design program in 8 months. That's not the same as not being able to. She looked at him. He looked back at the road, calm and unhurried, as if what he'd just said was perfectly ordinary, which she supposed it was. It wasn't profound, it was just accurate. And accuracy, delivered without performance, was something she'd been starving for without knowing it. She didn't open the design program that day, but she thought about it all through her PT session, which annoyed Greta because she kept losing count of her reps. She opened it 2 days later, at 1 a.m, at her kitchen table with the city spread out beyond the windows. The program loaded, the files were there. The old North Bank files, 8 months old now, the last version she'd been working when the accident happened. She looked at the screen for a long time without doing anything. Then she moved the cursor to the floor plan she'd been developing and opened it. It was good. She remembered now. She'd been genuinely proud of it, the way the ground level flowed outward toward the street, the way she'd eliminated the dead zones that plagued most commercial developments. She zoomed in. She found 3 things she'd have done differently even then, had she had more time, and one section of the entrance plaza design that struck her now as wrong, in a way she couldn't immediately articulate but would need to fix. She pulled up a new layer and started sketching. At 3:15 she stopped. Her neck ached. Her eyes were dry. She had 4 pages of notes and 2 revised elevation concepts, and something that felt, distantly but genuinely, like the particular satisfaction that had driven her through every 14-hour day of the last decade. She saved the file. She sat back. Outside, the city did its 3 a.m. thing. Quiet, but not silent. Always moving somewhere beneath the surface. She looked at it with different eyes than she'd had at 1 in the morning. Not healed eyes, not fixed eyes, just eyes that had been at work on something real for 2 hours and were accordingly tired and satisfied in a way she'd forgotten she was capable of. She went to sleep. She woke up and went to PT. She didn't tell Mason about the design session until he asked why she seemed distracted during their afternoon drive. "I was up until 3 working on the North Bank design," she said. "Yeah?" He glanced at her. Something in his face, not surprise exactly, more like recognition of something he'd been expecting. "How was it?" "Painful." "And good." "Both." He nodded once, like someone confirming a thing they already knew. "Don't say anything," she said. "I wasn't going to." "You had a look." "I don't have a look." "You have several looks, and that was one of them." He was quiet for a second. "Which one?" "The one that means you were right about something." He kept his face very neutral. "I genuinely don't know what you're talking about." She looked out the window. The corner of her mouth moved in a way it hadn't in a long time. Emma had a loose tooth. This was apparently the most significant event of the autumn season, and she reported developments to Celeste with the regularity and detail of a field correspondent covering a breaking story. It had been loose for 3 weeks. It was getting looser. She could move it with her tongue. She could move it with her finger. She had demonstrated both methods, unprompted. "What happens when it comes out?" Celeste asked. They were in the lobby of the rehab center on a Wednesday afternoon when Mason had brought Emma along because the after-school program had closed for a staff development day. Emma was sitting on the bench beside Celeste's chair, with her legs swinging free, wearing rain boots with frogs on them that she had apparently selected herself and was extremely satisfied with. "The tooth?" Emma looked at her like the question was slightly basic. "I put it under my pillow. And then? And then I get money." "Who brings the money?" Emma considered this seriously. "It just happens," she said. Dad doesn't explain it very well." Celeste looked across the lobby at Mason, who was at the counter getting coffee and very deliberately not looking over. "I think your dad is leaving the mystery intact on purpose." "What does intact mean?" "He's keeping the surprise." Emma absorbed this and seemed satisfied. "Dad's good at surprises. He made me a birthday cake last month that looked like a dinosaur." "Did it look like a good dinosaur?" "It looked like a dinosaur that had an accident," Emma said, with the frank assessment of someone who loves the person and still tells the truth. "But it tasted really good." Celeste looked at the child beside her. The swinging frog boots, the gap where the tooth was working its way loose, the total absence of self-consciousness, and felt that thing again. The thing she'd felt the first time Emma pushed her wheelchair down the hall, which was not happiness but was shaped like its architecture. "Your dad works very hard," Celeste said, not to Emma specifically, but to her because she was there. "I know," Emma said, with the simple gravity of a child who has noticed a real thing. "He's always tired, but he doesn't say so." She paused. "He says we're okay. He says it a lot." Celeste looked at the child's hands in her lap. Small, still, with chipped blue nail polish on 2 of the fingers, clearly done by Emma herself. "What do you think?" Emma thought about it. "I think we're okay," she said. "I think we're just also sad sometimes. At the same time. Both." 7 years old. Celeste stared at the middle distance and thought about what it cost to raise a child who could hold that kind of truth without flinching. Mason came back with the coffees. He set one on the arm of the bench beside Celeste, one on the counter for himself. He looked at Emma. "What are you two talking about?" "The tooth," Emma said immediately, which was not entirely untrue. She told Mason about his daughter, a week later, on a quiet afternoon by the river when Emma wasn't there. Not as a report. Not as something designed to do anything. She just said, "Emma told me you're tired, but you don't say so." He was quiet for a long moment. "Kids notice everything," he said. "She said she thinks you're both okay, and also sad. At the same time." He looked at the water. "She's not wrong. How long has it been since you weren't both of those things at once?" He thought about it for longer than the question seemed to require on the surface, which meant he was thinking about what the real answer was rather than the easy one. 18 months, he finally said. "My wife, when she was diagnosed, it went fast. 8 months from diagnosis to..." He stopped. Emma was 5. She understood some of it. I don't think she understood the part where understanding didn't help. Celeste sat with that. I didn't know how to grieve and take care of her at the same time, Mason said. So I mostly just took care of her, which is probably why Emma notices when I'm tired. She's been watching me try not to fall apart for 2 years. She doesn't think you're falling apart, Celeste said. No? She thinks you're working very hard. Those aren't the same thing. He looked at the water. The autumn light made the river look older than it was, slow and gold and carrying everything downstream without complaint. He rubbed a hand over his jaw. A gesture she'd catalogued without meaning to, the one he made when something had gotten through the practical surface of him and reached something underneath. She talks to you, he said. Emma talks to everyone. She's not picky. She doesn't, he started, stopped, tried again. She stopped talking about her mom to most people. She talks to you about things. Celeste looked at the water. She didn't talk to me about her mom. She talked to you about me, about what she notices. He was quiet. She doesn't do that. Not anymore. Not since... She went quiet about a lot of things after. He paused. It's good that she's talking. Celeste didn't know what to say, which was unusual enough for her that she sat in it instead of filling the space. She asked me last week if you were our friend, Mason said. What did you say? I said I thought so. Is that okay? The question landed more carefully than it sounded. She understood what was underneath it, not just whether she minded the label, but whether she was still in a place where the word friend was something she could hold without dropping it. Yes, she said. That's okay. He nodded. He looked at the water. He didn't make it bigger than it was, and she was grateful for that, because she might have backed away from anything bigger. The North Bank design consumed her evenings in a way she hadn't expected. She had told herself she was just revisiting it, reviewing, updating, getting back up to speed. But the work pulled her in the way real work always had, with a gravity that forgot to check whether she had other things to do first. She found herself calling Glenn at unconventional hours with questions about the site constraints that had come back from the environmental review, pulling dimensions and setbacks and utility easements into conversations she was barely aware she was having until she was an hour deep into them. Glenn started calling her first sometimes, which was its own form of progress, the company's nervous system rerouting itself back toward the person who had built it. She was rough in the early sessions. Designs that would have taken her a day now took 3. Her hand was uncertain on the drafting tools, and her eye for proportion, once automatic, the way her body had once known how to run without being told, kept second-guessing itself. She deleted things she shouldn't have and kept things she should have deleted, and one night spent 40 minutes on a section of the entrance plaza design before realizing she was recreating a version she'd already discarded 2 weeks ago. She closed the program and sat back and breathed. Then she opened it again. The entrance plaza came together on a Thursday at 11 at night, 3 weeks into the late-night design sessions. Not perfectly. There was a circulation issue on the south end she'd need to resolve, and the accessibility grade on the main entry path was technically compliant but instinctively wrong, and she made a note to fix both. But the concept was there, finally solid, and it was better than what she'd had before the accident. That was the thing she hadn't anticipated. The new version wasn't just recovered, it was better, as if 8 months of stillness had done something to the part of her brain that made architectural decisions. She texted Mason at 11:30, which was something she would not have done 2 months ago and barely registered doing now. She typed, I finished the North Bank entrance design. It's better than it was. The response came back in less than a minute, which meant he was still up. I know it is. She stared at that for a moment. You haven't seen it. Doesn't matter. She sat in her kitchen with the phone in her hand, and outside the windows, the city moved through its nighttime rhythms. And she thought about a man with a beat-up truck and a 7-year-old with frog boots and the particular quality of attention he'd brought to her every single day since September, which was not the attention of someone doing a job, or someone managing a difficult client, or someone navigating a situation they found awkward. It was the attention of someone who had looked at her, not the CEO, not the accident, not the rehabilitation case, and decided she was worth watching. She put the phone down. She looked at the design on her screen. She thought, I'm not going to examine this right now. She was very good at that. It would be useful for a while longer. She knew, somewhere she wasn't ready to look directly, that it would stop being useful eventually. That the thing building itself between the three of them, herself, Mason, Emma, had passed the point where it could be managed by not looking at it. That it had its own weight now, its own weather, and it was going to ask something of her that she wasn't sure she knew how to give. But not tonight. Tonight, the entrance plaza was finished, and the city was doing its thing outside her windows, and her phone screen still showed a message from a man who believed in a design he hadn't seen. She turned off the light and went to bed. Emma's tooth came out on a Tuesday, during what she later described to Celeste as lunch, kind of suddenly. Mason texted Celeste the news with a photo of Emma holding the tooth up with an expression of complete triumph, and Celeste looked at the photo for a moment longer than she normally looked at phone photos, and then she texted back. "Tell her congratulations. That's a significant event." Mason replied, "She wants to tell you herself." 10 minutes later, her phone rang. Emma's voice was slightly muffled. She was apparently talking around the gap in her teeth, which she was finding fascinating. "It came out," Emma announced. "I heard. How do you feel?" "Weird. There's a hole." A pause. "Did you ever have a loose tooth?" "Everyone has loose teeth when they're your age." "Was it weird for you?" "Probably. I don't remember it well." "I'm going to remember this one," Emma said, with the certainty of a 7-year-old making a declaration to the universe. "I'm going to remember it forever." Celeste smiled. It happened before she could think about whether to. "I think that's a reasonable plan. Are you coming on Friday?" "I have PT on Friday." "After PT." "We'll see." "That means yes," Emma said, with the confident interpretive skills of a child who has decoded the adult habit of softening certainties. "Dad says that too. We'll see." "Your dad is a wise man." "He's okay," Emma said, with the specific measured endorsement of someone who loves the subject completely and is therefore not going to oversell it. "He made pancakes this morning that were really flat, though." "Did they taste good?" "Yeah, but they were very flat." "Noted," Celeste said. After she hung up, she sat in the quiet of the midday apartment. She had a noon break on Tuesdays, a gap between occupational therapy and an afternoon appointment, and looked at the phone and then at the room around her and then out the windows at the city in its daytime rhythm, and she felt something she had been trained, very thoroughly, not to feel in the direction of people she wasn't sure could hold the weight of it. She felt, without armor, and without the usual 10-second gap she always gave herself before she let anything real in, something clear and ordinary and terrifying. She did not want to lose this. Any of it. The river road and the coffee from 2 blocks over and Mason's bridge book and Emma's tooth and the entrance plaza that was better than it had been, and the three of them in the truck on Tuesday afternoons like some version of something she'd stopped believing she'd get to have. She sat with it. She didn't push it away. She didn't name it out loud, even to herself. She just let it exist, small and real and complicated, in the middle of the Tuesday afternoon. Outside, the city kept moving. The river kept going. Autumn had deepened into the kind of cold that finally meant it, and somewhere across town a 7-year-old was carrying a small tooth home in a plastic bag, already planning the pillow, already certain she would remember this day forever. Celeste thought, maybe she was right. Maybe some days you just know, before they're over, that they're going to stay. The rumor reached her on a Thursday morning, the way most damaging things do, sideways from an unexpected direction, when her defenses were pointed somewhere else. She was in the occupational therapy room, working through the fine motor exercises her OT specialist, a quiet, focused man named Ray, had designed to rebuild the hand precision she needed for detailed drafting work. It was tedious, necessary work. Small pegs moved between small holes, a task that would have taken her 3 seconds before the accident and now required full attention. She was halfway through the second set when she heard the voices in the hallway outside the open door. 2 women. She didn't know them. Clients or family members, probably. She'd seen both of them in the lobby before, the kind of faces that register without attaching names. The mobility assistant? The tall one who's always with the CEO woman? Mason something? Apparently he's been telling people she's investing in his business. Some construction thing. A pause. Footsteps slowing. Investing how? I don't know the details, but apparently it didn't take him long to figure out who she was. I mean, Holloway Real Estate, she's worth, I don't even know, a lot. And he's working 3 jobs. The other woman made a sound that said everything without saying anything. Smart. I mean, she's in a wheelchair now. She probably just wants someone around who treats her normally. Easy enough to do if the payoff is right. They moved on down the hallway. Their voices faded. The lobby swallowed them. Ray said from his position across the table, "You want to take a break?" "No," Celeste said. She moved the next peg. Her hand was very steady. She had trained herself long ago to keep her hand steady when her chest was doing what it was doing now. She finished the exercise. She thanked Ray. She went out to the lobby, where Mason was sitting with his bridge book, and she looked at him across the space. The worn bag, the canvas jacket, the easy posture of a man who was comfortable with waiting. And she felt something that was not rational and not fair, and was also, somewhere under the fear where she couldn't argue it away, completely inevitable. The thing about Celeste Holloway was this. She had built her entire professional life on the ability to read situations before they became problems, to identify risk early, to protect what mattered. It was what made her good at her job and difficult to be close to, and she had known that about herself for years and made her peace with it. Derek had said, the day he ended the engagement, that she never let anything be easy, that she was always waiting for the catch, always positioned slightly sideways to the good things, never fully in them. She had thought about that a lot in the months since. She'd thought about it and decided he wasn't entirely wrong, and also that he'd said it to make his leaving feel like her failure. Both things could be true. "Ready?" Mason said, looking up. "Yes," she said. She was very quiet in the truck. He didn't push it. Yes. She spent 3 days with the rumor before she decided what to do with it. 3 days of sitting with it, the way you sit with a splinter you can feel but can't see. Knowing it's there, knowing it will get worse if you don't deal with it, unable to stop probing it with your attention. She told herself she was being rational. She told herself she was just thinking it through, gathering information, not letting fear drive the analysis. But Celeste was honest enough with herself, on her better days, to know that what she was actually doing was building a case. Taking the thing she was afraid of and finding evidence that matched it, because confirming a fear hurt less than being blindsided by it. Had Mason ever mentioned her company before she'd brought it up herself? She tried to reconstruct their early conversations. He'd been professional from the start. He'd been careful about the line between assistance and intrusion. But he worked in construction. He'd lost his job when his company was acquired. He had medical debt and a daughter and was running 3 jobs on an income that clearly didn't reach far enough. He had a dream about starting his own business. And she was Celeste Holloway. She knew what she was worth. Not in the personal sense. She'd spent a long time not knowing that. But in the transactional sense, the number on the ledger that made people recalibrate when they found out. She'd watched it happen her whole career, the way people adjusted, the way the friendliness acquired a slightly different texture. The way help that had been genuinely offered started being offered with awareness of what it might return. She'd learned to see it early. She'd become very good at it. The problem was that she had also, somewhere in the last 3 months, stopped looking. She had let herself be in the truck on Tuesday afternoons without checking for the angle. She had let herself call him at 11:30 at night about a design she'd finished. She had let herself talk. Actually talk the way she hadn't talked to anyone in years. And she had told herself it was safe. People didn't change. That was the thing. She had evidence going back a long way that people didn't change. On Sunday night, she opened her laptop and started drafting an email to Donna at the intake office about transitioning to a self-directed mobility plan for the remainder of her program. She wrote 3 paragraphs. She closed it without sending it. She opened it again Monday morning and added a 4th paragraph and closed it again. She sat by her windows and watched the city do its Sunday night thing and thought about Emma on the phone saying, "I'm going to remember this day forever about a tooth, just a tooth, a small piece of a child's body that fell out the way it was supposed to, and somehow that was the thing that made Celeste's chest do something too complicated to name. She missed her. That was the simple version. She missed the frog boots and the running commentary, and the frank, unsentimental affection of a child who hadn't learned yet to be strategic about who she gave it to. But missing Emma and trusting Mason were not the same calculation, and Celeste had never confused her feelings for her analysis. That was one of the things that had made her successful, and one of the things that had made her lonely, and she had never fully separated those 2 facts. She sent the email Monday morning. Then she put her phone face down on the kitchen table and made coffee and stood at the window for a long time. But He called her at 9:15. She looked at the screen. She let it ring twice, which was one more ring than she needed. Then she answered. Celeste. His voice had something in it, not accusation, nothing as useful as that, just a careful steadiness that she recognized as the same steadiness he brought to everything, which she was currently trying very hard to dislike. I got the message from Donna. What happened? Nothing happened. I'm moving to a self-directed plan for the last few weeks of my program. It makes sense given where I am in my recovery. A pause. Okay, he said, carefully. Is this about something I did? It's a practical decision about my rehabilitation plan. Celeste, I appreciate your work over the past few months. I'll make sure to give Donna a strong review. The silence that came back was long enough that she thought he might have accepted it, might have taken the door she'd opened and walked through it cleanly the way a man who had done what the rumor said would have walked through it, taking his cards and cutting his losses. Instead, he said, Someone said something to you. She didn't answer. Or you heard something, or you talked yourself into something, which I know you know how to do that. Not angry, something more difficult than angry. Whatever it is, I'd rather you just say it. I don't think that's necessary. I do. Mason, just say it. His voice held its steadiness, but there was something underneath it now, something taut. You've been direct with me since the first day. Don't stop because this one is harder. She looked at the window. The city was doing its Monday morning thing outside, full of movement and commerce and the ordinary business of people who had somewhere to be. She had somewhere to be, too. She had PT at 9:30 and her life to rebuild and a design on her laptop that she was prouder of than anything she'd made in 3 years, and none of that required her to have this conversation. I heard that you've been telling people I'm investing in your construction business, she said, that you knew who I was early on, that the proximity was useful. The silence this time was different in texture. Who told you that? He said. It doesn't matter. It matters to me. Why? Because you want to know who to correct the story with? Because... He stopped. She could hear him breathing, controlled the way he got when something had actually landed. Because that's not true. Any of it. I haven't told anyone you're investing in anything. I haven't told anyone anything about you, because that's not my information to tell. And I knew who you were when Donna gave me your file, which is information in your file, not something I researched. People find out who I am, and they adjust, she said. Her voice was very flat. That's not an accusation. It's just how it works. I've watched it my entire career. I know, he said. I know you have. But I'm telling you it's not what happened here. How do I know that? You don't, he said. That's the honest answer. You can't verify it the way you verify a contract. You just have to decide what you believe. She looked at her hands on the kitchen table. She thought about what he'd said by the river in September, that people build themselves over and over, that she just had to build this version. She thought about all the things she'd said out loud in that truck on Tuesday afternoons that she hadn't said out loud to anyone in years, and how it had felt less like danger and more like finally being able to breathe, and how she had told herself that was real and then heard 2 women in a hallway and immediately started building the case that it wasn't. I'm not good at this, she said. Which part? Deciding what I believe about people. He was quiet for a moment. I know. That's not a skill set I've needed a lot. I know that too. Mason, I'm not going to try to convince you, he said. I don't think it works that way. But I want you to know that whatever you decide, whatever you need, the last few months were real, for me and for Emma. That part isn't up for review. She sat with that. Okay, she said finally. Okay, you believe me? Or okay, you hear me? She breathed out. Okay, I hear you. I don't know about the other part yet. Yeah, he said. Okay. He didn't push it further. She had expected him to, expected the next move, the argument, the attempt to close the distance while she was uncertain. He didn't make any of those moves. He just said he'd let her figure it out, and that Emma had asked about her, and then he said goodbye and hung up. She sat at the table for a long time after. Then she did something that was not a decision so much as a capitulation to the thing she'd been fighting since Sunday. She picked up the phone and called Donna and canceled the transition request. She didn't examine it, she just did it. But the week that followed was not fixed. Nothing about them was ever going to be simply fixed. She understood that. There was still the ghost of the rumor sitting in the room between them, and there was still the thing she'd said on the phone, the admission that she didn't know what she believed about people, which was real and true and could not be taken back. She had said it out loud, to him specifically, and that was its own exposure. But they went back to the river road. Thursday afternoon, gray and cold, the trees mostly bare now, the river the color of pewter under a flat winter sky. He brought the coffee. She brought the revised North Bank elevation package, printed out, because she'd been wanting to show someone who would actually understand the structural elements and not just the visual. She spread the pages on the truck dashboard. He looked at them without speaking for a full minute, which was the right amount of time. Long enough to actually look, short enough that he wasn't performing it. The entrance plaza, he said, pointing. This grade here, this is for accessibility? The code minimum is 2%. I have it at 1.2. It costs more in the foundation design, but the usability difference is significant. This overhang here, you're cantilevering off the main structural core? Off a secondary support. Glenn's engineering team flagged it as aggressive. I think they're being conservative. He traced the line with his finger. You'd need a specific concrete pour sequence for this. Most contractors would want to stage it in 3 sections. You'd get a visible seam at the joint. She hadn't thought about that. Or she had, distantly, and set it aside as a construction problem rather than a design problem. Can it be hidden? Depends on your finish spec. If you're doing poured in place with an exposed aggregate finish, you could match the texture enough that it reads as intentional. Board form might be cleaner. He looked at the elevation. Who's your structural engineer on this? We haven't gotten that far yet. I've been working in concept. I know a guy. He's done some innovative work on cantilever systems in mixed-use buildings. Not local, but he does consulting. She looked at him. He was still looking at the drawings, his finger tracing the overhang, and there was nothing in his face except the thing she'd come to recognize as genuine interest. The same look he had reading about bridge construction, the same look he'd had the first time she'd described the North Bank concept out loud. The look of someone who found the mechanics of how things were built genuinely compelling. It was not the look of someone calculating a return on proximity. She knew she could not be certain of that. She'd already established that certainty wasn't available in this particular transaction. But she looked at him, looking at her drawings, and she thought about what she actually knew. Not what she feared, not what history had taught her to expect, but what she actually knew from 4 months of watching this specific person move through his specific life. What she knew was this. He was tired all the time and didn't perform it. He loved his daughter in the practical, daily, unglamorous way that real love almost always looked like. He had never asked her for anything. He had never looked at her with the slight adjustment in the eyes that she'd learned to recognize in people who had recently found out what she was worth. He had looked at her with the same level, direct attention on the first day as on the 100th, and it had never once felt like management. She looked at the drawings. She looked at him. "Do you want to see the interior layout?" she said. He looked up. "Yeah," he said. "I do." Well, 2 weeks later, she found out where the rumor had come from. Glenn mentioned it on their Wednesday call, offhandedly, in the context of something else. He was talking about a small competitor who had been making noise about the North Bank site, claiming connections to the original landowner, trying to manufacture leverage that didn't exist. In describing this person's tactics, Glenn said, "He's the same one who was putting around that story about your care assistant, the investment rumor, completely fabricated, apparently designed to isolate you from support while you were in recovery, make it harder for you to trust people. Classic destabilization play." Celeste sat very still. "Who is he?" she said. Glenn told her. It was a name she knew. A developer she'd outbid twice. A man whose professional ego had never recovered from losing those deals, who had been watching for an opening since the accident, watching for the moment when she was most vulnerable to being pushed further down. She ended the call. She sat in the quiet apartment. She thought about herself at the kitchen table on Sunday morning, building the case, finding the evidence, turning the fear into a document she could work from. She thought about Mason on the phone, not defending himself but saying whatever you decide. The last few months were real. She thought about how close she'd come to making the call that would have cleared the board of every good thing the past 4 months had built. She sat with all of that for a long time. Then she called Mason. He picked up on the second ring. She said, "I know where the rumor came from. It was manufactured by a competitor who's been trying to create leverage against me. There was no truth in it. I should have said that to you differently. On the phone that day. I should have said it wasn't about you." A pause. "Okay," he said. "I'm not good at— I know. That's not an excuse. I know that too." She breathed out. "I'm sorry." He was quiet for a moment. She'd known, when she dialed, that she didn't know how he'd take this. She'd known it might land awkwardly, or that he might be more hurt than he'd shown, or that the 2 weeks of careful re-navigation since the phone call might have changed something she couldn't get back. "Thank you," he said, "for finding out and for calling." That was all. Not "it's fine," and not "I told you so," and not any of the things the moment invited. Just, "Thank you for doing that." She thought, this is what it looks like. Not perfect, not smooth, not the version of a relationship she'd have designed from scratch if someone had handed her a specification sheet. Two people who were bad at this in different ways, making the adjustment, staying in it. She thought, I don't know what this is yet, but I'm not going to cut it loose because I got scared. That was as far as she got. That was enough for now. The cold came in fast that final week of November, the kind of cold that arrived with intention and made clear it was going to stay. The city adjusted. Heavier coats, breath clouding at bus stops, the river going flat and dark under low skies. Celeste's PT sessions shifted to reflect her progress. Greta adding strength protocols that would have been impossible in September, noting improvements in the matter-of-fact way she noted everything, which meant they were real. On the Friday before December, Mason arrived with coffee and a canvas bag she didn't recognize, which he set on the floor of the lobby without explaining. "What's in the bag?" she said. "Something Emma wanted to send. She couldn't be here. She's at school. But she said to tell you it was important and you had to open it today, specifically." Celeste looked at the bag. She looked at Mason. He had his poker face on, which was not actually very effective. She opened the bag. Inside, wrapped in 2 layers of notebook paper taped together with an excessive amount of tape, was a small orange plastic animal. The main one. She stared at it. "She wanted you to have it," Mason said. His voice was entirely controlled in the way people's voices got when they were being very careful about something. "She said you should have something important." Those were her words. "I told her you might want to pick your own important things, and she said—" He stopped. What did she say? He was quiet for a second. "She said sometimes the important things pick you." Celeste sat in the lobby of the Ashwood Rehabilitation Institute on a cold Friday morning in late November, holding a small orange plastic animal of unclear species, and did not say anything for a long moment. "She's 7, she finally said. "I know," Mason said. "She's terrifyingly perceptive." "I live with her." "I know." She looked at the animal in her hand. She turned it over. It was scuffed in a few places, worn smooth in others from use. A real thing from a real child, given with the total absence of strategy that only children and people who had stopped being afraid managed to sustain. She put it carefully in her jacket pocket. "Tell her thank you," she said. "You can tell her yourself," Mason said. "She's asked if you'll come to dinner Saturday." "I said I'd ask. I'm asking." She looked at him. He looked back. The level, direct look that had disoriented her the very first day and had never once changed its quality. "Okay," she said. Something shifted in his face. Not dramatic. Just the quiet rearrangement of something that had been held carefully and was now, very slightly, allowed to rest. "Okay," he said. Outside, the cold settled in around the city, patient and certain, and the morning moved forward the way mornings do regardless of everything, carrying them along with it into whatever was next. Dinner at Mason's apartment was not what she'd expected, which should not have surprised her, because nothing about Mason was ever what she'd expected. She had built a picture in her head, driving over on Saturday evening in the accessible car service she'd been using since October. Something functional and minimal. A single father running 3 jobs didn't have much bandwidth for home aesthetics. She'd imagined the kitchen of someone eating standing up, the living room of someone who slept on the couch more often than the bed, because the couch was closer to wherever the evening ended. What she found was a place that was small and clearly stretched at the seams of a budget that didn't leave much room, but was also, unmistakably, a home. Emma's drawings covered a full section of the hallway wall, not stuck up haphazardly, but arranged with real care, different sizes and subjects. Some framed in the cheap frames you bought at discount stores when you wanted something to feel deliberate. The kitchen smelled like garlic and something with tomatoes, and there were two mismatched chairs at the table that had clearly been acquired at different times and somehow worked together anyway. There was a stack of library books on the counter beside the coffee maker, half of them Emma's, half Mason's, and the bridge book, a newer one, different from the one in the truck, sitting on top with a receipt as a bookmark. Mason met her at the door, held it while she negotiated the threshold. A slight lip he'd put a small wooden ramp over, which she noticed and did not comment on because commenting would have made it larger than it was, and said, "Emma's been ready since noon. It's 6:30. I know, it's been a long afternoon." Emma appeared from the hallway like a person who had been waiting just out of frame for exactly the right moment to enter, which she probably had been. She was wearing her good sweater. Celeste could tell it was the good sweater because it matched her pants, which the frog boot outfits never did. And she had done something to her hair that suggested effort and resulted in a slightly lopsided braid. "You came," Emma said. "I said I would." "Dad says that doesn't always mean people come." Mason made a face from behind Emma that communicated several things at once, including mild mortification and a complete inability to argue with the accuracy. Celeste looked at Emma. "Your dad is usually right," she said, "but I came." Emma nodded, satisfied, and led the way to the kitchen with the authority of someone conducting a tour of their domain. Dinner was pasta with the tomato sauce that Mason had clearly been working on for some time, bread that was slightly over-toasted on one side, and a salad Emma had made herself under supervision, which she explained had involved a disagreement about the cucumbers that she declined to elaborate on. The cucumbers were in the salad. The disagreement had clearly been resolved in their favor. They ate at the small table. Emma sat across from Celeste and ate with the focused efficiency of a child who had decided to be well-behaved and was taking it seriously, which meant she occasionally forgot and talked with her mouth full, and then remembered and looked guilty, and then forgot again. Mason asked about the North Bank timeline. Celeste told him about the environmental clearance and the accelerated acquisition schedule and the conversation she'd had with Glenn about bringing the design back in-house rather than farming it to a contracted firm. "You'd lead the design?" Mason asked. "I'd lead it. I'd need to hire. I had a team before. Some of them are still available. I've been in touch. But the core concept work I want to do myself." The entrance plaza. Among other things, the accessible infrastructure throughout the whole development. I've been looking at what exists in the city, in most cities actually, and the baseline is technically compliant and functionally inadequate. Meeting code is not the same as designing something people can actually use with dignity. I want to do the second thing. He was looking at her with that look. She'd gotten better at accepting it. The look that was not admiration in the performed sense, but something quieter, more like recognition. "That's a different project than you were building before the accident," he said. "Yes," she said, "it is." Emma, who had been monitoring the adult conversation with the peripheral attention of a child who knew when something important was being said, looked at Celeste and said, "Because of your wheelchair?" "Emma," Mason said. "It's okay," Celeste said. She looked at Emma. "Partly because of that, and partly because I understand some things now that I didn't understand before." Emma considered this. "Like what?" "Like how much it matters when a space is built for you instead of around you. When someone thought about you specifically when they were designing it, instead of just making sure you wouldn't get stuck." Emma thought about that for a long moment, turning her fork in the pasta. "My school has a ramp," she said, "but it goes to the side door. The front door has steps." "That's exactly what I mean," Celeste said. Emma nodded slowly, with the gravity of someone adding a fact to a growing file. Then she said, "Can I show you my drawings after dinner?" "I'd like that," Celeste said. Emma smiled and went back to her pasta with renewed purpose, as if the evening had now achieved its objective, and she could enjoy the rest of it without concern. The drawings were pinned on Emma's bedroom wall in addition to the hallway. A whole ecosystem of them, some clearly older, the figures simpler, and some more recent and more detailed. There were animals and houses, and what appeared to be a map of somewhere Emma had invented, with place names written in her careful second-grade handwriting. "This one," Emma said, pointing to a drawing near the window. It was a building, rendered in the specific way children rendered buildings, front-facing, symmetrical, with exactly 4 windows and a door in the middle. But there was something different about this one. The door was wider than the others. There was a ramp drawn in careful diagonal lines to the left of the steps. Celeste looked at it for a moment. "When did you draw this?" she said. "A few weeks ago." Emma said it matter-of-factly. "I was thinking about what you said, about spaces that were built for people. So I drew a building that was built for everyone." Celeste looked at the drawing. The wide door. The ramp alongside the steps, not instead of them. Alongside, so that both were there, so that no one had to go around or to the side or find the back entrance. "Emma," she said, "this is really good." Emma looked pleased but also took it as her due, which was correct. "I know," she said. "Dad said it was creative. I think it's also practical." "It's both." "Those aren't usually opposites," Emma said, with the confidence of someone who had clearly heard this said by someone else and absorbed it as her own. Celeste looked at Mason in the doorway. He had the expression of a man watching something he'd hoped for without letting himself plan on it. She looked back at the drawing. She thought, this is what it means to be part of a life. Not the grand gesture. Not the dramatic moment. This, standing in a small bedroom looking at a child's drawing of a building with a ramp, built for everyone because a 7-year-old had been paying attention. She thought, I want to be someone who deserves this. I'm going to have to figure out how to do that. December arrived and the city shifted into its winter register. The rehab program entered its final phase, which meant Celeste's official sessions were winding down, and with them the structure that had organized the last 4 months. Greta, on the second-to-last Friday, sat across from her in the PT room after the session and said, without ceremony, "You've made strong progress. The functional gains are real. What you do with the next 6 months determines a lot." "What should I be doing?" "Consistent home program. Minimum 5 days a week. Don't stop because you're busy. Don't stop because you feel better. Both of those are the same mistake." "And the long term?" Greta looked at her with the direct gaze that Celeste had come to understand was just how Greta looked at everyone. Not severity, but precision. "The injury doesn't reverse. You know that. But function builds over time with consistent work. And some of what you've lost may continue to return over months and years. I've seen patients 2 years out still making meaningful gains." She paused. "Your discipline. That matters more than almost anything else." Celeste nodded. "Also," Greta said, standing, "you seem like less of a disaster than when you came in." "Is that the clinical assessment?" "That's the honest one." Greta picked up her clipboard. "The clinical one is in your discharge summary." She left. Celeste sat in the empty PT room for a moment, looking at the equipment and the therapy mats and the wall-mounted mirrors that she had spent months avoiding and had recently started using as practical feedback tools. 4 months of this room. The specific smell of the foam mats, the particular squeak of the wheels on the clinic's chairs against the rubber floor, Greta's voice counting reps without inflection. She was going to miss it in the complicated way you missed hard things you were glad were over. She wheeled out to the lobby. Mason was there with the coffee, same as always. "Last official week," he said. "Greta told me I seem like less of a disaster." High praise. "That's what I thought." She took the coffee. "What happens to your schedule after this?" He leaned against the lobby counter. "I've got 2 other clients lined up through the agency. Starts in January." She nodded. She looked at the coffee. She thought about how to say the next thing without making it something it wasn't yet, without loading it with more weight than it could currently carry. "I want to talk to you about something," she said. "Not today, but soon." He looked at her steadily. "Okay. About the construction company." Something shifted in his face. Not quite guarded, more like braced, the way people got when they didn't want something too much. "Celeste, I'm not doing it I'm not offering charity. I want to be clear about that up front." She looked at him directly. "The North Bank project is going to need a contractor for the accessibility infrastructure work specifically. Someone who understands both the structural requirements and the design intent, and who will push back when something that's technically compliant is functionally wrong." She paused. I can't give that contract to a company that doesn't exist yet, but I can structure a development agreement that would let you establish the company and build the credentials to compete for it. The numbers would work. I've run them. He was quiet for a long time. You've run the numbers, he said. I had Glenn look at the framework. It's solid. I'm not asking you to decide now. I'm asking you to think about it and talk to me when you're ready. Celeste. His voice had something in it she hadn't heard before. Not the careful steadiness, not the warmth, something more complicated than either. You don't have to do this. I know I don't have to. I don't want you doing it because, Mason, she said it with the same directness he always brought to her. I'm doing it because it's a good business decision for a project I care about, and because you're the right person for the work, and because I've been watching you hold 4 things at once for 4 months, and I think you're tired. She held his gaze. You told me people build themselves over and over. I'm trying to do that. So are you. This is me deciding that your rebuild matters to me, not as charity, as a choice. He looked at her for a long moment. The lobby was quiet around them. A couple in the corner, a staff member crossing to the front desk, the ordinary movement of the building going about its day. I need to think about it, he said. I know. I'm serious. I'm not saying no. I'm saying I need to actually think about it. That's all I asked. He nodded. He looked at his coffee cup. He looked back at her. Thank you, he said. Just that. Not, I don't deserve this, and not you're too generous, and not any of the self-diminishing things people said when they'd been running on empty for so long they'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone put something in the tank. Just, thank you. Don't thank me yet, she said. It's going to be a lot of work. Yeah, he said. I figured. The rain started on a Thursday. Not the fine, cold drizzle the city had been managing for weeks, but real rain. The kind that arrived with wind behind it and turned the streets reflective and made the world 20 degrees colder than the temperature actually justified. By Friday afternoon, it was sheeting against the windows of Celeste's apartment, and the weather app on her phone was throwing up warnings about wind and standing water and reduced visibility. She had an appointment. Not rehab. The official program had ended 3 days earlier. A meeting with the Architectural Licensing Board, a routine check-in about her continued professional standing that her attorney had scheduled weeks ago, and that she'd been quietly anxious about in a way she hadn't admitted to anyone, because it was the kind of anxiety that felt too specific to explain. What if they look at me differently now? What if the chair changes something they don't say out loud? She had prepped for it the way she prepped for everything, thoroughly, methodically, with documentation and precedent and a clear articulation of her current project commitments. She was ready, she just didn't want to go alone. She sat in the apartment for 20 minutes after the car service confirmed availability and felt the particular quality of alone that was different from solitude, the one that had an edge to it, that reminded her of hospital ceilings and Derek's face in the fluorescent light. She called Mason. I have a meeting at 2, she said. I know we're not in program anymore and this isn't your job, but I wanted to ask what time do you need to leave? She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. 1:15. I'll be there at 1. He was there at 1. He came upstairs. He'd been up before, twice now, to look at the North Bank files she'd printed and spread across the dining table. And she was ready, and they went down to the truck, and the rain was doing what it had promised to do, and he drove carefully through streets that were slick and full of spray. She had the documents in a folder on her lap. She was not nervous. She had decided not to be nervous, and was mostly succeeding except for the way her right hand kept finding the folder's edge and pressing it. Tell me about the cantilever problem, she said. He glanced at her. He understood. She needed something concrete, something structural, something her brain could work on while the rest of her handled the other thing. The concrete pour sequence? Yeah, walk me through it. He walked her through it. The sequence, the staging, the way the formwork had to be engineered to hold the weight during the cure period, the specific challenge of getting a consistent aggregate finish across poured sections. He talked about it the way he talked about everything that engaged him, with the focus of someone who found the problem genuinely interesting, not someone filling silence. She listened and asked questions and pressed him on specifics she didn't understand, and felt herself settle, degree by degree, into the focused working version of herself she trusted most. They arrived at the building with 10 minutes to spare. I'll be in the lobby, he said. You don't have to wait. I know. He looked at her. I'll be in the lobby. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. The board members were professional and thorough, and there was one moment, when a question about her current functional capacity landed wrong, clinical and slightly dehumanizing, and she answered it with the same clarity she'd bring to any professional inquiry, and by the end of it had 3 current project references on their record and a verbal confirmation that her standing was in no way affected by her medical situation, which she had known and still needed to hear said out loud by someone with authority to say it. She came out to the lobby, and Mason was there, coffee in hand. He'd found something nearby in the 40 minutes, of course he had. And he looked up from his phone and didn't ask how it went. He just stood. She said, "Fine. It went fine." He nodded. He handed her the coffee. They went back out into the rain. It was 3 weeks later, on a Saturday, that she heard what people were saying. Not a hallway rumor this time. A direct conversation. A former colleague, a woman named Petra who ran a competing development firm and had always occupied that specific social zone of friendly rivalry, called to catch up and said, without particular malice, "I've been hearing interesting things about you, Celeste." "What things?" "That you're back. The North Bank project, the accessibility focus, and that you've got some construction guy helping you. Or maybe it's more than helping." A light laugh. Not cruel. Just the conversational shorthand of their professional world, where personal and professional blurred constantly, and everyone tracked everyone else's combinations. "He's a contractor," Celeste said. "I've brought him on for the project." "Right, but I heard—" "Petra." Her voice was even. "What did you hear?" A slight pause. "Just that it seemed like a convenient arrangement. For him, given the investment." Celeste sat with that for a moment, sat with the familiar shape of it. The angle, the implication, the same architecture as the rumor from the hallway in November. Different source. Same story, and this time she knew exactly where it led and what it cost and what she was going to do about it. "Mason Thatcher is the most qualified person I've found for the specific intersection of structural and accessibility work this project requires," she said. "The development agreement is structured at market rate. It was reviewed by my attorney and Glenn's team. If you'd like the details, I'll have Glenn send you the framework, because I have no issue with transparency on any of it." A pause. "And if someone is manufacturing a different version of that story, I'd like to know who." Silence. Then, "I didn't mean, I was just repeating what I'd heard." "I know," Celeste said, "which is why I'd like to know who said it." By Monday, she had a name. The same developer as before. The same person who had tried to isolate her in November, who had apparently decided that the story still had traction and was still worth running. She forwarded the information to her attorney with a note that said, "Please advise on options." She told Mason that evening, not to alarm him. She'd already decided this was manageable, a nuisance rather than a threat, but because she'd made a commitment after November to not handle things about him without telling him. He was quiet for a moment. "Same guy. Same guy. What are you doing about it?" "Attorney's involved. We have enough to send a cease and desist with teeth. He'll stop." "Celeste." "It's handled, Mason. I'm not telling you because I need you to do anything. I'm telling you because I said I would." He was quiet again. When he spoke, his voice had the texture of something working through it. "You know what the worst part of November was?" "What?" "It wasn't that you believed it. I understood that. Given everything. It was that you went quiet. You just went quiet." He paused. "I'd gotten used to you not going quiet." She sat with that. "I know," she said. "I'm sorry." "You already apologized." "I'm doing it again." A beat. Then something in his voice shifted. Not quite a laugh, but the sound adjacent to one. "Okay. Okay," she said. The design studio came together in February. It had been Mason's suggestion, which had initially felt like too much, which she'd told him as much, said it wasn't necessary, said she could work from the dining table. He'd pointed out, with the polite persistence that she'd learned was his version of not letting something go, that the dining table was covered in printed site plans, that she was working until 2 a.m. on a chair that was wrong for her posture, and that the second bedroom she was using as storage had better light than any other room in the apartment. I'd need to reconfigure it, she said. I know, I could do that. Mason, it's not a gift, he said. Charge me rent on the table I'm always working at when I come over. She looked at him. The North Bank files were spread between them on the dining table, which was, he was not wrong, completely covered. That's a very bad deal for you. I think I'll survive it. She let him do it. He came on 3 Saturdays with 2 guys from the crew he'd been quietly assembling, both of them solid, she could see that, the kind of workers who moved efficiently and didn't need constant direction and cleaned up after themselves. They cleared the second bedroom, reconfigured the layout, built a custom desk at the right height for her working position, installed a wall-mounted drafting surface she could work at from the chair, and put up shelving for the printed materials that were colonizing every flat surface in the apartment. He was there on the 3rd Saturday when they finished, the crew gone, the room quiet and light-filled and ready. He stood in the doorway while she moved through it slowly, tried the desk, moved to the drafting wall, checked the sight lines to the window. She sat at the desk. She put her hands on the surface. The light came in from the east window and fell across the desk in the flat, even way that was best for design work. The North Bank files were already there, moved from the dining table, organized in the system she'd developed over 3 months of late nights. It's good, she said. Yeah, he said. It is. She looked at the room, at the desk built to her dimensions, the shelving at the right height, the drafting surface she'd mentioned wanting once in passing 3 weeks ago, and which had apparently been noted and incorporated without announcement. She thought about what it meant when someone paid that quality of attention to your specific needs. Not your general needs, not the needs of someone in your category, but yours, learned over time, applied without fanfare. She looked at him in the doorway. Mason, she said. He looked at her. She had a thing she wanted to say. She had been working toward it for weeks without naming it, feeling its shape in the dark like someone reaching toward something they can't see clearly. She wasn't ready to say all of it, but she was ready to say some of it. I know what this is now, she said. Between us. I know what it is. I'm not going to keep not knowing. He was very still. I'm not asking you to do anything with that right now, she said. I know we're both... She gestured slightly, meaning complicated, still rebuilding, not simple. But I didn't want to keep pretending I didn't know. He looked at her for a long moment. The light from the east window made the room feel warmer than it was. I know too, he said. I've known for a while. Why didn't you? Because it was yours to say first. He said it simply. You needed it to be yours. She looked at the desk. She looked at her hands on its surface. She thought about a woman in a hospital room 8 months ago, staring at a ceiling crack, cataloging everything she'd lost, unable to imagine what came next. She thought about a lobby at 9 in the morning and a man 2 minutes late who didn't over-apologize for it, and a river road in autumn, and a small orange plastic animal in her jacket pocket. She thought, I have been building this version of myself for 8 months, and I am not done, and I may never be done, and that is going to have to be all right. She thought, he already knows that. Okay, she said. Okay. Outside, February moved through the city in its gray and patient way, and in the apartment the light held its position across the new desk, and somewhere across town, a 7-year-old was probably telling someone about a building she had drawn with a ramp beside the steps, built for everyone, which was already more true than most things people twice her age managed to understand. Spring came to the city the way it always did, not announcing itself but accumulating, 1 degree at a time, until one morning you stepped outside and realized the air had changed, and the change had been happening for weeks without your permission. Celeste noticed it first from the design studio window. The east-facing light that had been cold and flat through February softened in March, went warmer in April, and by the first week of May was coming through the glass with something that felt, if you were paying attention, like a different quality of invitation. She had been paying attention more than she used to. That was one of the things the last year had done to her, slowed her gaze down until the world had texture again. She was at the drafting wall at 7:30 on a Tuesday morning when her phone buzzed with a calendar reminder. North Bank Phase 1 presentation, City Planning Board, 10 a.m. She looked at it for a moment, then looked back at the elevation drawing she'd been working on, then looked at the reminder again. She was ready. She had been ready for 2 weeks, and had spent those 2 weeks second-guessing the readiness, which was its own kind of ready. She texted Glenn, I'll be there at 9:30. He texted back in under a minute. The board pre-read the accessibility sections. 3 of them want to talk about replicating the framework citywide. She set the phone down. She sat at the drafting wall and looked at the drawing. The North Bank entrance plaza in its final form, the wide doors and the grade at 1.2%, and the ramp running alongside the steps rather than replacing them, built for everyone. Emma's principle, rendered in architectural documentation. She thought about a woman who had stared at a hospital ceiling 14 months ago and tried to calculate what was left worth keeping. She thought about the distance between that woman and the one sitting at this desk, in this room, with this drawing. Not healed. She was never going to tell herself the word healed, because healed implied a return to an original state, and the original state was gone and she had stopped pretending otherwise. But she had built something from the ruins of it, something that bore her fingerprints, and the fingerprints of a man with a bridge book and a 7-year-old who drew buildings for everyone. She put the phone in her bag, gathered the presentation folders, and went to get dressed. The planning board meeting was in a room on the 6th floor of City Hall with long windows looking east and a table that seated 12 people who represented the bureaucratic machinery that stood between a design concept and a shovel in the ground. Celeste had been in rooms like this her whole career, on the other side of the table, presenting proposals for projects that moved money and shaped neighborhoods. She had not been in a room like this in a wheelchair. She noticed it when she wheeled through the door. The slight recalibration in some of the faces, the adjustment that passed through the room before the professional veneer reasserted itself. She noticed it the way she'd learned to notice things in the last year. Without letting the noticing become an argument, she had to settle in her own head before she could continue. She set her folders on the table. She looked at the 12 faces. She said, "Thank you for your time. I'm going to start with the accessibility framework because I think it will reframe how you see everything else that follows." She talked for 40 minutes. She showed them the entrance plaza design, the interior circulation system, the public outdoor spaces with their graded paths and seating areas that accommodated every configuration of body and mobility. She showed them the cost modeling that demonstrated the accessibility features were not budget additions, but integrated design decisions that reduced long-term maintenance and increased the site's value as public infrastructure. She showed them Emma's principle, not by name, not crediting a 7-year-old explicitly in a city planning meeting, but in concept, not instead of, but alongside. For everyone. The board member who asked the most questions was a woman named Alderman Torres, who was 62 and had been on the planning board for 11 years and had, according to Glenn's background research, a brother who used a wheelchair following a stroke. She asked about the grade specifications on the secondary paths, about the surface material choices in the outdoor areas, about the sightline engineering at the main entrance. She asked them like someone who had spent time with someone who could tell her what was wrong with most buildings, and Celeste answered like someone who now knew the same things from the same direction. When the presentation ended and the board began their discussion, Celeste sat and listened and felt something she had not felt in a professional context for 14 months, the specific grounded satisfaction of having said the true thing in the right room. 3 members voted to request a follow-up session about replicating the framework for the city's existing public infrastructure portfolio. Torres moved the motion. It passed 7-2. Glenn, sitting 2 seats down, wrote on his notepad and slid it toward her. It said, "I told you." She didn't write back, but something crossed her face that people who knew her would have recognized as the closest she got to gloating, which was not very close but was visible if you knew where to look. Mason was waiting outside City Hall when she came out. She hadn't asked him to be. She'd told him about the meeting, the way she told him most things now, and hadn't said anything about needing him there, and he'd shown up anyway. He was leaning against a planter at the bottom of the accessible ramp, hands in his jacket pockets, watching the street. She came down the ramp and he turned and looked at her face and said, "Yeah?" 7-2, she said, "and Torres wants to talk about a citywide framework." Something broke open in his face. Not controlled, not managed, just real. He crossed the last 2 steps between them and crouched down to her level in the way she'd seen him do 100 times, never making her crane her neck, never standing above her in a conversation that mattered. He put his hands on the arms of her chair, not touching her, just there. "Celeste," he said, "just that." "I know," she said. He stood. He looked at the building, then at her, then at the street where the spring morning was doing its thing, light on the pavement, a vendor on the corner, The ordinary motion of a city going about its Tuesday without knowing that in a room on the 6th floor, something had just changed about how it might build its future. "Coffee?" he said. "The good kind," she said. "Obviously," he said, and they went. Thatcher Construction filed its articles of organization on a Wednesday afternoon in late March, 3 months before the North Bank groundbreaking. Mason sent her a photo of the paperwork, no caption. She sent back, "It's about time." He sent back, "I'm going to use that as the company motto." She had structured the investment the way she'd told him she would, clean, documented, at market rate, with Glenn's team reviewing every line. It was not charity, and it was not complicated. It was one person deciding that another person's capacity for good work was worth backing, which was something Celeste had done 40 times in her professional career for people she'd known less well and trusted less fully. What made it different was that she cared what happened to him. Not just to the investment, to him. She'd stopped pretending she didn't know the difference. The two men Mason had brought to the design studio in February, Dario and Frank, both experienced residential contractors, both people Mason had worked alongside for years before the layoffs, came on as the initial crew. Dario had a specialty in accessible design installation that turned out to be rare and valuable. Frank was the steadiest framer Mason had worked with in a decade. They were not a big operation. They were 3 men with the right skills and a woman's capital and a project that was going to ask more of them than they'd been asked before. Mason called her on the evening they got the contractor's license confirmed. It was past 9, and Celeste was at the drafting wall, and he said without preamble, "It's real now." "It was real when you decided it was," she said. "That's a nicer way to say it than the paperwork version." "The paperwork version is also real. Both things are true." He was quiet for a moment. She heard something in the background that sounded like Emma's voice, further away, calling something from another room. "Emma's still up?" Celeste said. She's been allegedly getting water for 40 minutes. She's eavesdropping. Obviously. His voice had the specific warmth it got when he talked about Emma, affectionate and slightly exasperated, and underneath both of those things, foundationally devoted. "She wants to know if you're coming Saturday." "What Saturday?" "She found out about the groundbreaking. She wants to be there. She made me promise to ask." The North Bank groundbreaking was 3 months away, but there was a small ceremony planned at the site for the formal signing of the development agreement. Next Saturday, actually. A modest thing. City officials and the development team and the contractor. She'd been going to mention it. "Tell her yes," Celeste said. "She should be there. She's on the design team." A pause. "She's 8. She's the reason the entrance plaza looks the way it does." She heard Mason relay this information to the invisible 8-year-old who was definitely getting water. She heard Emma's response, a sound of pure satisfaction that needed no translation. "She's going to be insufferable about this," Mason said. "She's going to be right about this," Celeste said. "Those aren't the same thing, but in this case they overlap." They had not put a name on it. That was a choice both of them had made without discussing it, which was its own kind of discussion. The conversation that happened in the space between two people who understood each other well enough to know what the other needed without asking. What they had was this. Tuesday afternoons that were no longer on any official schedule but continued anyway, gravitating toward the river road by habit, and because neither of them wanted to stop. Saturday dinners at Mason's apartment that had moved from occasional to expected, Emma setting Celeste's place at the table without being asked, a routine that had settled into the week's architecture the way the most natural things settled, quietly, without announcement, until you couldn't remember the version of the week that didn't have it. Late phone calls that started as work conversations and ended somewhere further in the territory of two people who had run out of professional distance and were operating in something more honest. And the things she'd said in February, "I know what this is," sat between them, named and unresolved and patient, the way real things were patient. Neither of them had pushed it. Both of them had let it accumulate the weight it was accumulating. The first time he held her hand, they were at the river. May now, the trees fully leafed, the water moving through afternoon light that had finally committed to warmth. They had been sitting in the truck with the windows down, talking about a cantilever detail on the North Bank drawings that had been revised 3 times and was finally right, and then they had stopped talking about the cantilever detail and were just sitting in the quiet of an afternoon that didn't require anything from them. His hand found hers on the center console. Not dramatic, not announced, just there. She looked at their hands. She thought about all the things she'd believed about herself, that she was built for velocity and not stillness, for achievement and not presence, for the professional and not the personal. She thought about the version of herself that had stood in the corner office at 29 and believed the future was a territory she was conquering. She thought about how thoroughly, how completely that version of herself had been wrong about what any of it was for. "Mason," she said. "Yeah. I'm glad you were 2 minutes late that first day." He looked at her. "What?" "It made you human. Before you were late, you were just the person I was supposed to need help from. After the 2 minutes, you were a person." He was quiet for a second. "I was late because I couldn't find parking." "I know, that's what I mean." He looked at the river. She felt his thumb move across the back of her hand, once without comment. "I'm glad Donna put us together," he said. "She has good instincts. I'm going to tell her that. She'll be insufferable about it, like Emma." "Yeah," he said. "Probably." The river moved. The afternoon held. Neither of them said anything else for a long time, and the silence had the quality that silence between two people only had when both of them were exactly where they wanted to be. The North Bank groundbreaking happened on a Thursday in June, under a sky that had started uncertain and resolved into something clear and warm by the time the ceremony began. The site was on the eastern edge of the development zone, a stretch of underused riverfront that had been waiting for decades for someone to decide what it wanted to be. Celeste had designed the public ceremony space with the site topography in mind. The accessible path from the street to the ceremony area graded and surfaced, the seating arranged so that nobody was behind anyone else. Nobody had a worse view because of where they sat or how they arrived. Glenn had raised an eyebrow at the setup costs. She'd told him it was non-negotiable, and Glenn, who had learned over 14 months how to read which of Celeste's positions were strategic starting points and which were the thing, had not pushed further. Emma stood beside Celeste's chair during the remarks from the city officials, wearing the good sweater again, braid only slightly lopsided, holding a small paper program with a gravity that suggested she understood the occasion and was prepared to honor it. When Alderman Torres spoke about the accessibility framework and described it as a new standard for how the city thought about public space, Emma looked at Celeste with an expression that was not quite "I told you so" and was definitely adjacent to it. "You're thinking it," Celeste murmured. "I'm being professional," Emma murmured back. "Good instinct." When the ceremonial shovels came out, a row of them, chrome-plated, lined up for the assembled officials and project leads, Glenn handed one to Celeste with the matter-of-fact practicality of someone who had thought it through. She held it. She looked at the ground where the first phase of the project would begin. She thought about what it meant to break ground. Not in the metaphorical sense. She'd broken enough metaphorical ground in the last year to last a career. The literal sense. The physical fact of a shovel going into earth as the first gesture of a thing that would exist for 100 years after you were gone. Buildings outlasted the people who built them. The decisions made at this stage, the grade of the path, the width of the door, the question of who the space was for, those decisions would be answered in steel and concrete and would stand. She pushed the shovel into the ground. The earth gave. She looked up. Mason was 10 feet away, standing with Dario and Frank, the three of them in their work clothes because the groundbreaking led directly into the first site assessment meeting, and they had not come to perform. He was watching her with a look she had a full vocabulary for now, the one that was not admiration in the public sense, but something private and direct, the look that said, "I see you, the whole thing, I see it." She looked back at the ground where the shovel had gone in. She thought, 14 months ago, I was in a hospital room trying to understand what was left. And what was left was this, all of this, which I could not have predicted and could not have built alone and did not, in fact, build alone. She thought that was worth knowing. She thought that was the thing nobody told you about devastation, that it didn't just take things. It also cleared space. And what grew in the cleared space depended entirely on what you were willing to let in. She had been very controlled about what she let in for a very long time. She had been precise and defended and efficient about it, and she had built something impressive in those conditions, and she had also been, without fully knowing it, profoundly alone. She was still precise. She was still controlled in the ways she needed to be controlled. But the defended part, the part that had stood watch at every entrance and turned away anything that might cost her something, that part had been renegotiated. It had taken a truck with a booster seat in the back and a 7-year-old with frog boots, and a man who waited through silence like he understood it needed to run its course. The renegotiation had cost her. It had required her to be wrong about things she'd been certain of, and to sit with the wrongness instead of managing it, and to choose, consciously, repeatedly, in the full knowledge that choosing meant risk, to let people matter. She thought it was the best renovation she'd ever done. Mas. That evening, after the groundbreaking and the site meeting and the late afternoon call with Glenn about the Phase 1 construction timeline, Mason drove her to the lakeside park on the city's south side. She had not been there before. He had mentioned it once, months ago, a place he used to go with Emma on Sunday mornings in the year after his wife died, when he needed somewhere open and quiet that wasn't the apartment where everything reminded him of what was missing. He hadn't explained why they were going tonight. She hadn't asked. The park was everything the name implied. A long stretch of grass sloping toward the water, old trees throwing long shadows in the evening light. A path that ran along the lakeside wide enough for 2 people to walk side by side. Or, as it turned out, wide enough for a wheelchair beside a person walking. The path was smooth and even, better than most of the city's public infrastructure, and she noted this with the professional part of her brain that never fully turned off, and also with the simpler part that was just glad. Emma ran ahead on the path the way children ran, without destination or urgency, just movement for its own sake, her shadow long in the June evening light. She found a stick and threw it, found another, spun in a circle for reasons she did not share, and then came back to report that there were ducks near the bank that were interested in people, and should they get closer. "Stay on the path," Mason said. "That's not a yes or a no." "It's a stay on the path." Emma made the expression of someone receiving an ambiguous ruling and returning to consult her own judgment, which she did by walking to the edge of the path closest to the bank and peering at the ducks from there, technically on the path. "She's going to be a lawyer," Celeste said. "Or a hostage negotiator," Mason said. "She finds the exact edge of every boundary and stands on it. That's a skill set. It's exhausting, is what it is." But he was watching Emma with the expression Celeste had learned was his true resting face when he wasn't managing anything, open, warm, the look of a man who was genuinely glad for what was in front of him. It was not the look of a man who had resolved his grief. She knew him well enough to know the grief was still there, would probably always be there in some form, the specific shape of a woman named Laura who had existed and mattered and then stopped existing without anyone's consent. That didn't go away. You carried it, and it got lighter and it got heavier depending on the season, and you learned to carry it without putting it down, because putting it down made it worse. She understood that better now than she had 14 months ago. She understood carrying things. "Mason," she said. He looked at her. "Are you happy?" He considered the question. He did not rush it, which was one of the things she trusted most about him. He did not rush questions that deserved time. He looked at Emma on the path ahead, at the lake going gold in the evening light, at the shadows of the old trees crossing the grass. "Yeah," he said. "I am." He looked at her. "Are you?" She looked at Emma's shadow on the path. She looked at the lake. She thought about the hospital ceiling crack, about the first Tuesday in September, about a river road in autumn, and a small orange plastic animal, and a room with good light that had been built to her dimensions. She thought about what happiness actually was. Not the thing she'd confused it with for most of her life, which was momentum, achievement, the feeling of moving fast enough that nothing could catch you. The real thing was slower and more demanding than that. It required you to be still enough to feel it. It required you to have let enough in that there was something to feel. "Yes," she said. "I am." He nodded once, like a fact confirmed. He looked at the lake. They were quiet for a while. The evening moved around them, the light changing through its late June gradations, the lake going from gold to copper to the first quiet blue of early dusk. Emma came back and stood beside Celeste's chair and reported that the ducks had been less interested in people than initially assessed, and had in fact moved to the far end of the bank and were no longer worth discussing. "Disappointing," Celeste said. "Very," Emma agreed. Then she looked at the lake and looked at her father and looked at Celeste and said in the frank, uncomplicated way she said most things, "I like it when we do this." "Do what?" Mason said. Emma gestured with her hand in a motion that included the lake and the path and the three of them and all of it. This, she said, just being somewhere. Mason and Celeste looked at each other over Emma's head. Neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. Emma sat down cross-legged on the path beside Celeste's chair, pulled her knees up, and watched the lake go blue. Celeste put her hand on the top of Emma's head for a moment. Not quite a gesture, not quite not. And Emma leaned into it the way children leaned into things they trusted, without examining the trust. Celeste kept her hand there. The lake kept going. The evening held them all. Bob, there is something that nobody tells you about the hardest years of your life. They tell you to be strong. They tell you it gets better. They tell you that you'll find meaning in it somehow, that the pain will shape you, that what doesn't end you makes you, and some of that is even true, in pieces, in the ways that cliches are true. They persist because there's a seed of recognition in them that people keep needing to plant. But what nobody tells you is this: the hardest years don't build you, not directly, not the way construction builds something, intentional, planned, one layer on the next. The hardest years clear the ground. They strip away the things you thought you needed, the structures you built to feel safe, the velocity you maintained to feel alive, the distance you kept to feel protected. They take all of that down and leave you in the middle of it, and the clearing is brutal, and it asks more of you than you believe you have. And then, only in that cleared space, only when you have been stripped enough that the performance of yourself has become too expensive to maintain, you find out what you actually are, what actually remains when everything else is gone. Celeste Holloway found out she was a person who needed people more than she'd admitted, who wanted to build things that lasted, and for people who had been forgotten in the building, who was capable of loving, slowly, carefully, with all the attendant terror of someone who understood exactly what it cost. The right small family on a lakeside path in the evening of a June day that nobody else would remember. She found out she was also still angry sometimes, still controlled in ways that could be walls, still likely to build the case before she built the connection. She didn't resolve those things. She made agreements with them. This is what I am. This is what I'm working on. This is the version I'm building now. Imperfect agreements that would need to be renegotiated. That was fine. That was how living worked, she'd finally learned. Not resolution. Renegotiation. Mason Thatcher found out he was enough. Not in the abstract, not as a motivation poster sentiment, but in the specific and daily sense. Enough for his daughter, enough for his work, enough for the woman who had spent a year letting him in. He found out that being tired and keeping going were not opposites, and that love was not something you'd earned by suffering through the right amount of loss. He found out, slowly, in the truck on Tuesday afternoons and Saturday dinners and late phone calls, that the happiness he'd convinced himself he'd used up was not a finite resource, that it had come back, different in shape, smaller in some ways and larger in others, but real and present in his. He also found out he still burned toast regularly, had a persistent inability to buy the muffin he actually wanted, and could spend 45 minutes explaining concrete pour sequences to someone who was only slightly as interested as he was. He made agreements with those things too. They were all part of the same person. Emma Thatcher found out that the world contained people outside her family who would show up for her, who would take her drawing seriously and come to her important days and hold her responsible for good ideas and let her push their wheelchair down the hallway and call it practice. She was 8. She was still finding out most things, which was appropriate. But she knew, with the bone-deep certainty of a child who had been paying close attention, that the three of them were something, a thing that had a shape and a weight and a future. She had been right about that since approximately the third Tuesday afternoon, though she'd had the good sense not to say so until much later. A month after the groundbreaking, Celeste received an invitation from the City Architectural Commission to present the North Bank Accessibility Framework at a regional planning conference in October. The invitation described the project as a potential model for integrated accessible design in urban development and asked if she would be available for a 45-minute keynote. She read the email twice. She looked at the design studio wall, the North Bank drawings, the cascading layers of a project that had started as a concept on a laptop at 1 a.m. and was now steel and concrete going into the ground on the eastern riverfront. She forwarded the email to Mason with no message. He replied in 4 minutes. Yes. Obviously, yes. She replied, I thought you'd say that. He replied, You forwarded it to me before you replied to them. She looked at that for a moment. She replied to the commission, I would be glad to present. Please send the details. Then she opened a new message to Glenn and started the thread that would eventually become the proposal for Holloway Real Estate's Accessibility Design Division, a dedicated team within the company focused on integrating the North Bank principles into every project that came through the firm. It would cost money to build. It would change how they competed for projects. It would require Glenn to adjust a strategy he'd been running successfully for 4 years. She wrote the initial concept in 40 minutes. It was good. She could tell when something was good. She sent it to Glenn with the subject line, read this tonight. Glenn replied at 11 p.m. I've been waiting for you to propose this for 6 months. She replied, then you should have said something. He replied, you weren't ready 6 months ago. She sat with that. She typed, you're right. She sent it. Glenn was one of the few people she could say that to without the words costing her something she couldn't afford, which meant she trusted him, which meant the last 14 months had done something to that relationship too. Everything she'd built before the accident was still there, not unchanged, reshaped, some of it strengthened and some of it dismantled and rebuilt, the way you rebuilt things when you understood them better. But there. The company, the work, the professional self that had started in a rented conference room and grown into something that moved through the world with weight. She hadn't lost it. She'd been afraid she had. She'd been afraid for months that the woman who built that thing was gone, and what was left was a smaller, diminished substitute. She knew now that was wrong. What was left was the same person with different sightlines, the same builder with a better understanding of what she was building for. And on a Saturday in late July, Mason came over to the design studio to go through the Phase 2 drawings that were going to the engineering team on Monday. Emma came with him, and Emma spent the first 20 minutes in the studio drawing at the corner of the drafting table that Celeste had cleared specifically for this purpose. Emma had a designated corner now, same as she had a designated place at the kitchen table on Saturday evenings. Some things became fixtures without a vote being called. The Phase 2 drawings were complex, the interior atrium design, the secondary accessibility routes, the integration of the public art installation that Celeste had fought for, and the development agreement, and that the budget team had pushed back on 3 times. And that was going in because Celeste had not moved on it. Mason worked through the structural notes while Celeste talked through the design intent, and they went back and forth the way they had learned to go back and forth. Not deferring to each other and not competing, but building on what the other said, each of them seeing something the other missed, the way 2 people with different expertise could make something better than either one alone. Emma, from her corner, said, the atrium is the best part. They both looked at her. I can tell from the drawing, Emma said, the way the light comes in. She pointed at the elevation. This part. You can tell it's going to feel like outside even when you're inside. Celeste looked at the elevation. Emma was exactly right. The atrium design was built around a specific quality of light that she had spent 3 weeks getting correct, and a second grader had identified it in 30 seconds from across the room. Emma, she said, when you're older, what do you want to do? Emma considered this with the seriousness she brought to most things. I want to design buildings, she said, or be a paleontologist, or maybe both. Both is possible, Celeste said. That's what Dad said. Your dad is right about most things. Mason, without looking up from the drawings, you can both stop. Emma grinned at Celeste. Celeste returned it. It was the particular frequency of the smile she'd been discovering she had more access to these days, not the polished, professional version she'd deployed in boardrooms for a decade, but the one that came up from somewhere lower and was less controlled, and was, she suspected, more her than anything the boardroom version had ever been. She looked at the atrium elevation. She looked at the room, the good east light, the North Bank drawings, the 2 people who had somehow become the architecture her days were built around. She thought about the principle she had spent 14 months learning, which was that you could not design a life around velocity and call it living. That presence was not a productivity problem. That letting people in was not a liability you managed, but a choice you made and kept making, every day, in the full knowledge that it asked something of you. She thought it was the most important design principle she'd ever learned. She thought she'd needed the worst year of her life to understand it. She thought that was a hard trade, and she would not romanticize it, and it was also, finally, the truth. Emma had gone back to drawing. Mason had gone back to the structural notes. The Saturday afternoon settled into the studio with the easy weight of something ordinary and chosen, and outside the east window the summer moved through its business, and across the city a stretch of riverfront was becoming something that hadn't existed before. A building with wide doors and a ramp beside the steps, built for everyone because someone had decided that everyone was worth building for. Celeste Holloway turned back to the drawing in front of her. She picked up her pencil. She had work to do. She had always had work to do. The difference was she finally knew what it was for.